Welcome back to another episode of the Drop-Tine podcast. I'm excited to pre-release the audio-only file of a great episode on wild health. Based on your feedback, we got the ball rolling on a video podcasting platform, something we're really looking forward to doing more of in 2026 and 2027, especially on chronic wasting disease, which is being handled in a very sloppy manner, starting with the language that's being used during discussions and educational events surrounding CWD. This episode is one of a handful that I recorded already with a very interesting guest, and I think you'll enjoy the angle. I've been wanting to record this episode with Cindy, who's across the pond in the UK, for a very long time now. The video podcast will be available soon on YouTube and other video podcasting platforms. So keep an eye out for a new and improved Drop-Tine podcast YouTube channel, and be sure to subscribe. Before we talk about wild health, I'd like to take some time to talk about why I developed the Reload series of seed blends. Almost a decade ago now, we completely shifted our focus away from the idea of feeding the plant to nourishing the soil health, because a healthy soil, robust and beneficial microbial life simply grows more nutritious plantscapes or food plots than those plots that are abused and void of soil biology. If you don't believe me, work on your own gut health and watch your symptoms disappear. Spring, summer, and fall Reload were developed because the food plot seed marketing companies, and there are many, were hyper-focused on just a few improved species that they claim deer prefer. The fact is, deer demand way more. Deer will eat a massively diverse diet of grasses, legumes, brassicas, and forbs when soil function is a primary focus. It's also true that plants fix dirt, and plants farm soil microbes. And if you understand how to plant diverse cocktails that act as biological primers in the soil, you can also enhance soil fertility without relying on so many expensive inputs like fertilizer and bugs in a jug. I've personally enjoyed watching many follow along. Every food plotter has heard that buckwheat can improve an overall fertility program by scavenging phosphorus from the bulk soil and making it more available for the other plants in the food plot. I have news for you. Buckwheat is not the only plant that has this skill. In fact, every plant offers a different organic acid release profile that improves soil health by feeding microbes, ultimately enhancing soil fertility. When developing the Reload blends, I worked on assembling a quorum of plant species that work well together, like the teammates on a football team, to accomplish a specific goal. This strategy is not cheap and it's not logistically simple, but it's well worth it in the end. If you want to improve your soil health, grow incredible looking food plots, attract deer, and offer more of what whitetails and other game species crave, check out the Reload blends at droptineseed.com. As your soil temperatures reach 60 to 63 degrees, start thinking about transitioning from spring Reload to summer Reload. Now let's get on with the show. If you've heard more than your fair share about diseases and wildlife populations in recent months and years, this podcast episode is for you. The perfect example is the rather frustrating debate surrounding chronic wasting disease in white-tailed deer and the sloppy management and misinformation surrounding it. Do I think this topic needs addressed by level-headed, truly knowledgeable, independent thinking people who don't benefit in any way, shape, or form other than for their love for the observation, management, or pursuit of the most popular big game animal in America? I absolutely do. Trust me, I'll have some colorful conversations in the very near future and reveal some true expert facts, not opinions, on the sloppy business of how CWD is currently being addressed by my wildlife professional colleagues and my fellow hunters alike. For just one example, and if you want to have a laugh, give a watch to the Meat Eater podcast titled The Truth About CWD, and watch the experts try to explain the Swiss cheese-like holes in the brains of animals with TSEs. Don't worry, I'll make sure myself or my experts educate you on the facts surrounding this topic and some questions that will make you ponder the real truth about CWD. But for now, forget about wildlife disease for once. Let's talk wild health. The fact is, most people form their opinions about the current health of wildlife species, including game animals such as white-tailed deer, by absorbing oftentimes erroneous and agenda-driven news media and inaccurate, influential internet content. I'm personally disgusted with just how inaccurate and misleading these sources of wildlife health are. Nature is cruel, they say. No. As a wildlife biologist, I would argue that nature is nature. And although sometimes seemingly unforgiving and cruel, she's just perfect the way she is. But I'd also argue that there's an abundance of health, life, vitality, self-medication, and resiliency in nature. We just need to know where to look. I'd like to bring some awareness to the multitude of wild health out there before we finally address the real truth behind CWD that so many otherwise successful platforms and talented individuals seem to be missing. The truth is, wildlife species face a persistent, perennial battle with diseases, pathogens, parasites, toxins, aging, and a multitude of weather factors that sometimes end in death. Such mortalities are a given in nature, and wildlife managers like myself are trained to adjust hunting season framework and the number of tags or permits accordingly. Oddly, many of my colleagues seem to have forgotten about these lessons in classes as they introduce harvest prescriptions that are completely counterintuitive. What does health really look like in the wild? Stay tuned, and you just might hear a side of the equation that very few are talking about. Enjoy the show.
Yeah, I was saying that the interest in wild health just keeps cycling. You know, there was a lot of interest when the book first came out 20 years ago, and there's been several resurgences since then, and there's quite a big interest at the moment.
Good.
Yeah.
I think that speaks to the nature of great work, right? I think great work is always relevant, and
Well, it's timeless stuff, isn't it? Really.
Absolutely. I've got my copy, and I know. Actually, I have two. I have two of these because I keep one at a different location,
Right.
and I want to make sure I always have one. But I first read that book many, many years ago, and it resonated with me. Maybe I shouldn't get too much in the weeds yet until we start, but let's just go ahead and. Are you good to start?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm fine.
I just want to shoot from the hip. Nothing
Yep.
fancy. No major narrative. Just wild health. So here we are, Cindy, talking about wild health finally after I think I went down through my email chain, and it's been at least 3 years that I've been wanting. I don't want to say we've been trying, that I've been wanting to do this. And
I've been saying yes, Jason, for 3 years.
yeah, I always felt like the timing wasn't perfect. I knew I wanted to record with you, but I felt like the timing wasn't perfect. And you know what? The timing is perfect right now because for me and you, for me, because I'm about to record an awful lot of material on chronic disease in wildlife, namely chronic wasting disease. And this is one of the reasons, and I know, well, this is one of the reasons that your book, Wild Health, resonated with me many, many years ago. And I've got, things highlighted in it and multiple copies. But yeah, it's been 3 years that we've been going back and forth on this, and now is the right time. So thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's interesting that in all that time since the book first came out, there's been a lot of research especially on livestock animals, because obviously that's the application. It's all very well understanding how wild animals keep themselves healthy, but so what? For most people. So it's that application of how to switch that information across into livestock management.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, the book is Wild Health, Lessons in Natural Wellness from the Animal Kingdom, right? And
that's one edition. Yeah, there are
Okay.
other editions.
So this copy, I guess do I have an older copy? Is that what I have?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's probably still available, but there is a more recent
Okay.
publication.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll have to get that copy with.
It's still called Wild Health, and it's still got the same material in it, so don't worry.
Well, I know, a lot of the material in the book it reminds me of Dr. Fred Provenza, who has been on my podcast in the past. And Fred is near and dear to me because he helped me as a wildlife biologist many years ago see things that no one had been able to help me see. So I actually read your book before his book, but both of them really kind of work hand in hand. I know you've kind of been a fan of Fred's work in the past.
Yeah, I think I mentioned him a lot.
You did.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Cindy,
Yeah.
Without getting too pessimistic, I will say that we're in a time where my fellow wildlife biologists and the experts, if you will, appear regularly on YouTube. You have all these outlets now, all these channels. In the past, it's. I know in your book you talk about media, television, and it's pretty much the same. But now we have it in our fingertips 24/7.
Yeah.
But these experts and many of my colleagues appear to talk about wildlife diseases like chronic wasting disease or CWD. Yet all throughout the woodlots, hedgerows, fields, etc., live wildlife, healthy. They fight, they breed, they raise their young, and they thrive. Cindy, they thrive. And
Well, this is what got me going.
Yeah, this is the perfect timing for me because
Yeah.
I'd like to intensively cover, really deep in the weeds, chronic wasting disease. But before I do that and get,
Yeah.
I guess, kind of negative on the disease, I wanted to bring you. So no offense, no pressure, but you are the optimist leading off, right? So we need a base hit and we need a runner on. But you won't see these types of stories like you bring to focus on these platforms that I previously mentioned. You've got wildlife that remain healthy while so many others struggle. And I regularly see my colleagues and well-known individuals with a massive followship detailing the struggle that white-tailed deer and mule deer, etc., have with chronic wasting disease. And, we're also watching as state and federal agencies fumble due to their sloppy approach handling chronic wasting disease. And I think they
It's really
fail to
interesting.
understand it. They really do. So
Yeah. I
let's
think
talk
it's a
health.
sort of I think it's a sort of conceptual shift, really, about, and we have it with human health as well. That anyway, we'll get into that in a minute. But when I first started looking at how do animals in the wild keep themselves healthy without access to vets? I mean, I've had horses, I've had dogs. They cost a fortune. How do they survive in the wild if they're so sickly in captivity? And then I looked at zoo animals, and they're incredibly sickly unless an awful lot is known about what is needed for them. So I started to look at, well, are wild animals actually healthy, or are we only seeing the survivors? And that's the usual assumption, isn't it? Is that, of course, they look healthy because all the sick ones have died. Now, natural selection is going on, but what we've missed is this massive amount of health maintenance behavior that wild animals partake in. They are managing their health 24/7. They don't just try and sort themselves out when they feel sick. Everything is about optimizing health, because at any moment you could be stressed by a predator or a situation. You need to be peak all the time. And so there's been this huge selective pressure for keeping yourself tip top as long as, as much as possible, not just when you feel ill. So we've got the natural diet changing according to what's going on inside them. So for example, there's work on rats and mice showing that if they've got one amino acid missing, they will change their diet until that amino acid is remedied. It's incredibly accurate. And so animals that are able to forage free range will be constantly adjusting to optimize the diet that they're taking. It's not just about energy. It's not just about nutrients. They'll be taking little bits of phytomedicines as well, just to keep everything tip top.
True.
And I mean, you must have read, I'm sure you know about the deer engaging in osteophagy, where they're actually killing little ground nesting birds and stripping the bones out of them when they've got low phosphorus levels. They don't do it when their phosphorus levels are fine. So they're changing their behavior according to what's going on inside. And of course, any kind of animal that's enclosed doesn't have that opportunity. The stuff that they're able to access, so they've got this health maintenance behavior, but they've also got this amazing pharmacy available, because, as I'm sure you know, there's an arms race going on in evolution between the herbivore and the plant. The plant doesn't want to be eaten, so it's evolved compounds to stop the herbivore from eating it. But a lot of those that are like alkaloids, for example, if they take too many of them, they're toxic. But in small doses, they're incredibly good at killing pathogens. So, if you're nibbling little and often rather than consuming a lot, then you've got this mild intake of toxins that will just keep your worm load down, just keep, So the whole idea, the whole approach of keeping animals healthy in captivity is that you give them energy and you give them these set number of nutrients, and when they're ill you pump them with a drug. And that is, it's just ridiculously simplistic because the health is an ecosystem, and the animal is in an ecosystem, and the whole ecosystem is utilized to maintain health. As soon as you take the animal out of there, you are juggling. You're juggling what's going on, aren't you?
Sure. You had mentioned free range, and I've got so many note cards, and I'd love for you to see the copies. I have 2 copies of your book, and they're highlighted, they're dog-eared. There's notes in the margins. But before, I wanted to mention that, the truth is, these diseased animals, albeit the rise, is there due to degraded habitats, malnourishment, habitat fragmentation, and toxins. We could go on and on. But there's also, this simple fact that they represent the perpetual process of life and death on land. But, the land and the wildlife that roam it live on it perpetually. At least I hope so. And I'm not downplaying disease, but there's this whole complexity of, habitat fragmentation. Are wild lands truly wild anymore? And how do animals sort of adapt, both inside being confined in, captivity or research facilities. And all this obviously incorporates maybe Fred should have been on this with us, when you put up fences, and this is where your
Yeah.
livestock conversation sort of comes in,
Yeah.
you no longer
Yeah.
allow wildlife to forage, with
Yeah.
utilizing
And
nutritional
it's
wisdom,
the
etc.
yeah, and the need for particular medicinal compounds can be so rare that nobody's noticed it before. So, for example, in the African elephant, they've discovered that an elephant can travel over 70 miles to get one particular compound that it needs in a plant, but it might only do it once in its lifetime. It might only need it once. And so you put a barrier up to protect them, and when that elephant gets that particular illness, it can't manage it. And no one's going to know. So just restricting the habitat is restricting access to the natural pharmacy. And it gets more and more difficult the more confined they are and the higher the density and so on.
Absolutely. I want to
Yeah.
shift gears just a little bit, and
Okay.
I've got two quotes from your book that if they make a note card, Cindy, in my world, kind of like, what was that, Johnny Carson? Do you remember Johnny Carson? If they make a
No,
note
I'm
card,
British.
it's a big deal. And one of my favorite quotes in your book was actually a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote. And I feel like this quote is one of the two that sort of encapsulates your entire book and your work. And it goes like this: the multitude of the sick shall not make us deny the existence of health. So I think, again, at a time when so many of my colleagues are spending millions and millions of dollars on a disease, CWD, that they don't fully understand, with sloppy publicity, human dimension work, etc., I think that this quote demands 20 or 30 minutes of conversation with many of us. So the multitude of the sick shall not make us deny the existence of health. What does that mean to you, Cindy?
It means, I mean, it's the same with human health, is that, everything that we describe as health when it comes to human health is actually sickness. We're not talking about how do people stay healthy. We're talking about how can we cure this disease? What drug can we make to cure this disease? And all the health focus is actually on sickness. And nobody is studying the healthy, successful animals. How are they doing it? I mean, I noticed, having said that there is now a lot of interest in how animals have thrived after Chernobyl, the radioactive disaster that we had in Europe.
Sure.
There are dogs, wild dogs, that are thriving and have absolutely no problems. And researchers are actually in there looking at how they've adapted so quickly, and what is it that's making them so healthy. And that, for me, is the obvious thing, is to look at the healthy ones. So if you've got wasting disease going around, you should be studying the ones that haven't got it,
Absolutely.
who've been exposed to it.
Absolutely.
What are they doing?
And some are, but
and
most are
yeah,
not. It tends to
yeah,
be research science that's ignored. Maybe the
yeah.
money's not there. Who knows? But I agree 100%.
So if I ask what sounds like a stupid question, but do you guys not know what happened with BSE in England?
Well, it's a great question, actually.
Because
Yes
yeah,
and no. Yes and no.
yeah,
My colleagues in the wildlife world, we're getting into something that perhaps is overlapping into my next, or one of my next podcasts, which is already recorded. But yes, TSEs, such as mad cow or variant CJD, etc. I feel like they took how do I say this? Because of a couple of individuals, and you talked about a race between plants and herbivores. In the 80s and the 90s, there was a race to win a prize called the Nobel Prize. And if you can win the Nobel Prize, it's quite prestigious. And it essentially paves the path for the rest of your career. And you get to say, aha, I was correct. Prions are 110% real. And I personally, we learned a little bit about TSEs. Most of my professors did not understand them. And in fact, they don't know any more about them today than what they did. A lot of them are doing, how do I say this? They're doing some work on it, but not like they should be. So yes and no.
Because what I'm meaning is that in the 70s and 80s, it was mismanagement. It was feeding meat and bone meal to herbivore cattle
Sure.
that caused it. And
Absolutely.
I am aware that deer are occasionally fed, and that may be it may be that is it the same
It's a
origin?
it's a it's a
Has
potential.
it come from cannibalization via the feed?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I planned on getting into this, but one of the topics that you cover, I think, phenomenally in your book, is this discussion where we hear far more about diseases passed from wild to domesticated animals. What about the converse? What about
It's the other
our
way round. Yeah,
yes. What about
it's the
our
other way round.
herds and
Yeah.
flocks? So now we're getting into TSEs and flocks of domestic animals, many being unhealthy and under stress, malnutrition, in captivity. We've destroyed their natural habitat, etc. They are spreading diseases to wild animals. And I want my
Yeah.
listeners to think sheep and scrapie. I don't know what you know about scrapie and sheep, but another TSE, when we talk about, when a lot of my colleagues talk about the origin of CWD, they start on page 15 and they miss an entire chapter or two. But they talk about discovering, early discovery of chronic wasting disease in a captive research facility in Colorado in 1967. What they failed to miss is an awful lot of research, politics, greed, money, Prusner, Weissman, all of these guys in the 80s and the 90s. They were in their professional careers long before that. But, I find it interesting that you discuss that in your book at great length, and I really enjoyed that segment where you talk about having obviously domestic animals introduce disease to wild animals, and
Yeah, I mean,
that research facility in Colorado, there's documentation that yes, there were mule deer there. However, there was also research being done on sheep, and there's a very good chance when you look at scrapie in sheep, and you look at chronic wasting disease in deer, they look very much alike, if not exactly the same.
Yeah, and I mean it happens all the time here in that we have high densities of animals in very unhygienic conditions and being pumped full of antibiotics and so on and so forth just to get them to the table. They are really sickly, and if they make contact with wildlife, they're exposing this sort of mega density of pathogens to wildlife. So and we have the issue here with badgers. Wild badgers are being accused of spreading TB to cattle. And it's like there's a lot of evidence it goes the other way.
That's still an issue there, by
It's
the way?
still an issue,
Still an
yeah.
issue. Okay.
Yeah.
Isn't it
But I
funny how
mean,
we
wildlife hasn't got anyone sticking up for it, has it? And the farmer has to make an income, and so there's on the one hand you've got shall we support the financial side or some wild animals, and of course the financial ones get the support.
Well, and obviously I'm an eater, so I
Yeah,
appreciate farmers to an extent. I
yeah,
can
yeah.
also
But no
collect
one's
my own
speaking up.
food. But yeah, I would agree with you. There is no counsel, there are no lawyers for
Yeah,
wildlife
yeah,
and white-tailed deer, etc. I want to now, since I'm on CWD, chronic wasting
yeah,
disease. It is a chronic disease. There's
mm,
I think there's an entirely 50 to maybe 70% of the data on the opposing side missing, ignored, deleted over the last 20, 30, even longer, 50 years. But there's a section in your book that reminds me of the knee-jerk reactions of the way that chronic wasting disease is managed, is currently being managed, and has been managed by state agencies. And I remember you basically saying, in what you considered to be a totally illogical response. I don't know if you remember this yet or not. You say wild animals successfully keeping disease at bay are often overkilled in order to protect sickly but profitable domestic livestock. And obviously,
Exactly.
you're in the UK. You had mentioned the badger situation, and that reminded me of the chronic wasting disease situation. Now, granted, the white-tailed deer, yes, they are raised by deer farmers in captivity, etc. But those of us who are sportsmen and we hunt, we like to hunt free-range white-tailed deer. It's frustrating when you have state agencies, sending sharpshooters out there to shoot perfectly healthy whitetails just to give us a prevalence rate and tell us what percentage,
Wow.
I don't like this term, had or were positive with CWD and those that were non-detect or negative. Thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I'll just sit back and let you go.
I mean, it came, as I was writing the book, we had foot and mouth here, and they were literally burning piles of dead cattle and piles of dead sheep, and where I live in the countryside just stank of burning flesh for months, and these were perfectly healthy animals, and it was to stop the spread of it.
Does that sound
And I'm going, look, if you've got animals that have been exposed and haven't got ill, you need those animals to breed from, to take serum from, to look at what they're eating, what they're doing differently. We need some real health research, not disease research. Let's look at what healthy animals are doing.
Absolutely. And fortunately, we do have scientists like Seabury and Henderson and Haley, some of these guys who are doing research looking at genetics and the genome of the whitetail, blah, 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 etc. However, I feel like we under-research the healthy, and we don't say to ourselves, how are they doing this? And this goes back
Exactly.
to what you said earlier.
It could be something really, it's not going to be this simple, but for example, it could be something really simple like they're digging and licking clay. Some toxins can be dealt with by digging to the right kind of clay. If they haven't got access to clay, they can't do it. They'll get sick. They'll get gastro problems. But it could be something that they are doing. And if you're not looking, if you're not studying the behavior of the healthy ones, you're just shooting them.
Absolutely.
You ain't gonna learn nothing.
And what's frustrating to me is these scientists do not understand, or let me rephrase that. They have not fully considered the science behind the alternative infectious agent. And again, I'll cover more of this in great detail in another podcast. So I don't want to cannibalize that podcast.
What do you mean by that? Yeah.
So the infectious agent is currently accepted or known. Science used to be about throwing everything and anything out there. When I trained in science in the 90s and early 2000s, we didn't get upset with each other if we just sat here and spitballed and shot from the hip. And I said, you know what, Cindy, everything you're saying is a bunch of hogwash. And you would say to me, great, Jason, we'll have a beer later, but right now, what are your data to say or prove that everything I just said is hogwash, right? So science has we have peer-reviewed junk right now where we have scientists who are able to select what peers review their papers so that they get accepted. That's just absolute hogwash. But this prion, I like to call it a prion now that I know Stan Prusner wanted it called a prion. I think Prusner is known, for anyone who's done the research. He was known to be not really an honest individual. When his paper came out in 1980 on the prion, one of his major employees or researchers on the project quit because he felt like there were some things that were overshot and overexplained and not done properly. But then he won a Nobel Prize, and now here we are. You know what? Prions are misfolded proteins, and that's just bullshit. That's complete hogwash. But I do want to say that the fear of animals as harbingers of disease is deeply ingrained, as you mentioned in your book, in the psyche of humans. And I think if we've, you know, there was a time somewhere in the book you were like, hey, you know, let's continue this line of thinking, and, you know, let's never exchange, you know, air or body fluids, or hell, let's just, as a human, let's kill every species out there just to be safe, just to be sure that nothing, you know, harms us. And, you know, I've picked your book up. You wrote the book, am I right? It first published in 2002.
Yeah, a long time ago.
So, you know, people talk about forward thinkers. 18 years after you published the first copy, which is what I'm holding, COVID comes along, and I'm reading the book, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Cindy nailed this, right? And, you know, even post-COVID, which we now know none of that stuff worked, that the silly nonsense.
And let's remember that COVID was blamed on an animal.
Right. Yeah, solid. Yeah.
Yep.
Good point. But as I read your book, and I reread books, and I came back to it, it made me think of gain of function. It made me look back at your book about certain, you know, things that were done with wildlife. But then there's a flip side to that coin as well. There's a flip side to, which I really want to spend more time talking about now, which is, and I want to talk about health and fitness, right? And how, you know, some animals are actually, you know, amongst a sea of, I mentioned it before, you know, viruses, parasites, all sorts of biting insects, etc. Can you talk about the research or the work done by, and I've got a note here that was it William Koresh? Did I say that right? It was a veterinarian.
Yeah.
And as I remember, there was a situation where he went out and he did some blood work and basically looked at the health of these animals. And I recall there being a parrot situation, the parrots, where he looked at you know, that they were successfully carrying these, you know, avian viruses that completely wipe out domesticated parrots, but then you have them living in the wild with these same pathogens, if you will, and yet they're showing no signs or no symptoms of disease.
So we get a really clear picture of that when you bring a wild animal into captivity in a zoo, and you take away all its natural health maintenance behavior. And if we take something like the long-legged fox in South America, they were really difficult to keep alive in captivity, because they would get this giant kidney worm and it would kill them. And so they went out and caught some long-legged foxes in the wild, and they still had giant kidney worms, but they were surviving. So it isn't the presence of the problem, it isn't the presence of the disease and the presence of the pathogen, they are managing it. So then the interesting thing was, well, how are they managing to survive with these giant kidney worms that kill them when they're in captivity?
Great question.
And they noticed that it was one particular plant that they were eating all year round, even though the plant boomed and busted. The plant was seasonal, but the fox maintained the same level of consumption of this. It's a member of the tomato family, Solanaceae. So it maintained the same level, constant level. And when they fed this to captive animals in the zoo, they survived. And so, you know, is this really simple example, which is lovely, which is that it isn't whether you catch the thing or not, it's how you manage it. And they are managing everything all the time.
You're getting ahead of me.
I'm sorry.
to my $1 million question, but we'll continue leading up to my $1 million question, and hopefully the listeners.
Oh, you should have told me. We were heading to a peak.
You know what? You bring up a good point. So many, Cindy. This is another thing that bothers me with science these days. When we used to have, like when I went to Mississippi State University, we had, fake defenses where we had to, present our work, whether it was a senior project or whatever. And then we had a panel of scientists, many of whom I watch now as experts. These are air quotes. And I would love to sit there and debate them on very popular podcasts. But, you could, back then you could ask questions, and now you can't. Now it's everybody's all sensitive, and almost all of the state, federal agencies and nonprofit organization representatives who I invite on this podcast request a list ahead of time of the questions I'm going to ask. So when you say, I wish you would have told me that, I want to point out right now that you never inferred, you never asked, you never requested, nope. Jason, what are we going to talk about? I said, hey, Cindy, let's just talk about wild health in your book. Okay, sure. I'm in the UK, by the way, so your 11 is my 4, right? So people need to know that. You never asked for any of this. But, you bring up great examples. And I could remember you also mentioned the Diker having serious pathogens like, I think, leptospirosis, but no visible ill effects. That's so
no
important.
symptoms.
No symptoms.
It is.
And then you mentioned,
and it's important when they're sampling wild animals. Is of course they're going to be carrying pathogens.
Yeah,
that's what happens in the wild.
I remember one of my favorites. I've got a slide in some of my talks that I call Wild Health, and of course I show a picture of your book. And one of my favorites is the African buffalo, where you mentioned that they've got this outstanding ability to resist disease. And you mentioned that when the buffalo encounter all the viral and bacterial disease, etc., they don't suffer. And then they test these critters, and they pull blood, and they say, oh my gosh, they've got leptospirosis and parainfluenza and bovine herpes and blue tongue and brucellosis, and it goes on. You mentioned foot and mouth, etc. As successful combatants, as you say in your book, of such infections, they're considered carriers of the disease.
Exactly.
And they're probably despised, as you say, by local farmers. But why are we not studying these critters?
Yeah.
And
they shouldn't be labeled carriers. They should be labeled heroes.
Yes.
They've battled everything and survived. And we need to know what they're doing.
I hate to keep beating on this, Cindy, but think about these individual white-tailed deer in America right now that show zero symptoms. And they're paying. There are those of us who are licensed buying sportsmen who pay to play, if you will. All of our Pittman Robertson funds go towards supporting these state agencies. Yet they're out there hiring sharpshooters, government sharpshooters or professional sharpshooters to kill, as one of the researchers said, any brown deer, just kill it. Now, what kind of sense does that make? There's no, let alone science. I'm not asking for the science. No. I don't need the science. There is none. No. Where's the common sense?
It's not even common sense, is it? No.
No.
And they're doing that to sample whether they've got pathogens in their blood or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And of course they will have. Because that's what that's what happens in the wild.
And then they say, well, the incubation period is very long, and while these critters are running around, they're shedding prions, which they don't even know what a prion is, by the way. They're shedding prions all over the environment. Well, of course they are. Yeah. They're shedding all kinds of things all over the environment, right? So I guess I just want to nail that before I get to my $1 million question, which you absolutely, this is my favorite.
I can't imagine what it is.
In your book. You've already kind of alluded to it, but I want to make sure the listeners hang on it. But all these assessments that we just talked about, with all these critters that host or carry these pathogens, if you will, they don't show diseases, they don't show symptoms. That's the epitome of health. And as you mentioned in your book, I think you quoted or mentioned a lot of the work of Goodall, which if you don't know who Jane Goodall is, you didn't listen in science at all. Schaller, I think it was, and some others. But
Yeah, George Schaller. Yeah.
yeah, but wild animals are infected with disease-causing organisms. People, I'm here to tell you, so are we, without showing any symptoms. And your
Exactly.
biological being is just waiting for something bad acutely to happen. You might be I know a lawyer who told me, Jason, my Lyme disease, it flares up. He's a lawyer. He said, every time I have to I have a really difficult case and I have to defend
Yeah.
somebody, I don't sleep, I eat at
Yeah.
McDonald's, it flares up. Well, guess what? If you break your leg playing football, even the biggest, healthiest, pulling defensive or offensive tackle can succumb to something as silly as the flu or whatever. Whereas otherwise, if he didn't experience that acute attack or some, immune, stressor, he wouldn't have that particular issue. So I just wanted to point that out and kind of wrap that up
Yeah,
with
it's
that.
got like we got. I see it like we've got some sort of threshold, before symptoms come, and it's very deeply ingrained, as you say, this idea that you catch a disease and that's it, you've got it, and it's nowhere near that simple.
No,
You have your body is fighting things all the time, and whether it wins or loses is the interesting
that's
thing.
right.
And that depends on your diet, your behavior, what's going on around you, your environment, and
Psychological,
those are the
your
things.
mental
Those are the things we
approach.
can change. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's like,
Yeah, I mean, and it happens in the animal kingdom as well. If you stress animals, their immune system is impacted, obviously.
yeah,
So,
absolutely. And I remember during COVID, and I still talk to people now who said, hey,
mm,
I never got COVID. A gentleman just told me the other day, and it's
yeah,
November 2025. I finally got COVID 5 years later, and I said, no, you know what? You've probably had the infectious material in your system,
yeah,
and
yeah,
you know what? It could also be the flu, which we've forgotten about mysteriously.
yeah,
But there
yeah,
are things that those who quote unquote did not get it or show any symptoms of getting COVID
yeah,
likely just had a good immune system. And sure, genetics
yeah.
genetics come into play. I'm sorry, they just do. But I'm sure you were harboring that particular virus. Your system fought it off, as you mentioned that
Yeah, I mean, it's the
level.
same. Apparently we're fighting off cancers all the time. And it's just a matter, we one day we lose, one day we don't. Um, but it's that the immune system incredibly complex, and
Mm.
I just think it's horrendously simplistic to stick with this kind of Victorian idea that there are these you catch a disease and that's it, you've got to be killed if you're wildlife.
Yeah, this is why I appreciate your input, because so many of my colleagues, when I wrote an article about it, the editor called me a voice in the wilderness, right? Which I've been told by a close friend that that's a biblical reference. I didn't know that, but it's a
Take it
great
as a compliment.
well, I guess, yeah. I said, what does that mean? Are you not going to publish my article? And he said, no, I'm going to publish it, but you're a voice in the
So
wilderness. So I
I
guess
think it's worse, presumably in America, because you've got big pharma being very powerful,
massive.
and obviously it's in their interests to think that you have one disease, you have one drug that kills that disease, and that's it.
Yes.
Whereas it is a lot more complicated, isn't it?
Yes. So I just want to wrap that up and say repeatedly, obviously, as you point out, Cindy, in your book, Wild Health, animals appear to be in good condition. When they take blood tests, guess what? Pathogens, parasites, oh my gosh. Do we panic? Do we slaughter them? Absolutely not. That's the epitome of health. That is not an unhealthy critter. And by the way, if you're a biologist, they're still fit in that condition because they're reproducing, producing offspring, who are then reproducing again, which that's what biologists refer to as fitness. So we're going to have to conclude, even
It's been great.
without my
Yeah.
experts here, it's normal or natural to be infected with low levels of pathogens and parasites in the wild. You going to argue with me on
Yeah.
that?
No, and their whole ecosystem is also adapted to those same pathogens. So the plants are also fighting viruses and bacteria and fungi. So,
Okay, are you ready for this, Cindy? This is the big $1 million.
okay.
This is the big $1 million question. It's Here, I actually have the book right here, and this page mark that I think you can probably see is on the page where this quote is. I'm building up the suspense. It's page 12. Page 12 in your book.
Okay.
I'd buy it just for that. So the question is, and I think you already said it, is the mere presence of a pathogen the same as the presence of the disease? Yes or no?
No, definitely not.
Boy, my colleagues would not like you. So what you're saying is to harbor pathogens without showing symptoms, as we've been talking about for 20, 30 minutes.
Yep. Yep.
That should be considered a sign of extremely good health, correct?
It's a sign of being extremely well adapted to your environment. You know, you've got the local pathogens in your system and you're not sick.
Right.
So you are fit.
So again, to me, that
Yeah.
when I read that on page 12 at the very beginning of that book, I thought, wow, this lady's got it together. This material is sound, it's solid, and by the way, in the very back of your book, you've got references upon references upon references for people nerds, geeks like me who want to read more and more. So
I had to over-reference it because I knew there was going to be quite a bit of pushback.
Well,
So
I said earlier, to conclude, I wasn't concluding the podcast. I was concluding that particular point.
all right.
And of course, I've been told I could talk about this stuff all day long. Imagine being at a cigar smoker or a cocktail party with me and talk about CWD. But I think you also said in there to continue to put that point to bed. You said it's because that they are the survivors that they are of interest to us. And I know we said this
Totally.
earlier, but I want the listeners to really take this home. That individual is the one we should be studying, not paying
Yep.
so much damn attention to the sick, the ill, and the diseased.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the other thing that hasn't come through quite so strongly from the book is that pathogens are different in different parts of the world. So you get a different strain of flu in Australia. By the time it comes over here, it's slightly different. And what you've got to remember is that wild animals are adapted to the pathogens in their local environment, but also the plants that they are eating have produced antimicrobials, antibacterials, antivirals, antifungals to those same pathogens. So they're getting really specific medicinal compounds. Yeah?
Yes.
Which we just completely forget about that in terms, even in the alternative scene. So someone will say, oh, for a cold you need such and such, but I mean that wouldn't be how it works. You would be if you were exposed to a particular bacteria, say, in your environment, and you're a herbivore, the antibacterials that you're consuming are also antibacterials that are going to be working on that specific species that they've been exposed to as well. Sure. It isn't just the animals that are exposed to pathogens, but the plants as well. So all evolving together. And so this is why it's so difficult when you take an animal out of its natural environment, or you don't allow it to forage the way it has evolved to forage. Is you're not just cutting off the medicinal compounds, but you're cutting off very specific sort of co-evolution, if you see what I mean, where they've evolved together to fight the same or similar pathogens.
And I want to point something out. We mentioned maintaining animals in confinement and research facilities, which I've worked in research facilities. I will say, excuse me, in this chronic wasting disease debacle, the state agencies, the federal agencies, and I'm sure I'm not making any friends right now, but quite frankly, I support the white-tailed deer. I would love to represent them as their counsel, and that's what I'm doing. So if someone has data, I'm more than willing to admit that I've been wrong if someone can prove what I say wrong about the CWD thing. But there are deer farmers here in America and elsewhere, obviously, who do a much, much better job at maintaining the health of the animals inside their enclosures. And the question comes up, why? How can they do so good, but perhaps some of the research, some of the universities, etc., don't? Well, first of all, it's their livelihood, right? It's just like the farmer that you mentioned. The deer farmers, if they have a pen full of disease and they have to depup that pen, that's their livelihood. They don't get a paycheck at the end of the week like a state or federal employee. And I find it ironic. We talk about immune system collapse. We talk about taking wild animals and sticking them in confinement. I find it absolutely ironic that one of the first or the first case of chronic wasting disease that received all the attention in 1967 is in a research facility in Colorado. I've been told by some of the folks who were there back then that there were no sheep, there were no other animals in that facility, but yet there are research papers that state that there in fact were sheep in that facility. So I find it interesting that they both brought domesticated animals in close proximity with wild animals, and they also had wild animals in an enclosed situation where we know that the immune system can absolutely collapse under that. It could be nutritional stress, sociological stress, or both. And to me,
or medicinal stress.
yeah, when people talk, right, exactly. When people talk about how did CWD start, well, gosh, where there's smoke, there's generally
But
fire.
are they still feeding meat and bone meal to herbivores?
So no. So obviously that was the mad cow issue, and that issue was resolved as soon as they stopped doing that, right? And when you look at Kuru in Papua New Guinea, where they had ritualistic cannibalism, and they also did cutting and injury and stuff like that. When they stopped, that also stopped. CWD is not really. It's related to those, but it's spread through the environment as well, we believe. But I don't know of anyone feeding, protein sources from other white-tailed deer, so bones and that sort of thing. I don't know of anyone doing that. I don't know that was necessarily the issue. Could it have come in through the feed for those Colorado mule deer? Absolutely, anything can happen. I personally believe that we're only following we're only looking at one side of the coin when it comes to the research, to the data. There was a whole group of great scientists. Some of them just happened to be women back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s who were hushed because everybody wanted Stan Prusner to receive his Nobel Prize for inventing a new pathogen that is not a living organism, in theory, is what they say. The prion, or prion. It irritated Stan when people called it a prion because a prion's actually a bird. So Stan has been invited on to my show many, many times. This is Prusner. He wants nothing to do with it. His, his fellow scientists who said, no, wait a minute, what Stan is showing is not really accurate. And I don't want to give too much away because I have podcasts on this topic. For some reason, Dr. Prusner was able to throw a lot of money at this, and he lobbied for a long, long time, and he won the Nobel Prize. Well, how difficult is it, Cindy, to give someone a Nobel Prize for inventing or discovering a new pathogen that doesn't have DNA, that has no nucleic acids, according to him.
Yeah.
I don't think this is true, but according to him, and say, wow, what a great find. I mean, you've got bacteria, you've got viruses, you have parasites. All of these things have nucleic acids, and then all of a sudden, Stan says, nope, this is a protein that misfolds inside the host. It's just complete hogwash, and I think we have followed the wrong path. At the very least, science is supposed to be about hearing both sides, and that's not what they've done. They've hushed an entire
science is going through a bit of a crisis at the moment, isn't it? I mean, science, there's an awful lot of corruption, unfortunately, an awful lot of bad practice, and I mean, I know, that in academia they're despairing about how can you now differentiate between good science and bad science, because nearly everyone is publishing without peer review now, just going straight, straight to publication in this sort of race to get published. Nobody's repeating anybody else's work, so on and so forth. So it's in a bit of a mess, but I hope it'll settle down and get some structure again to quality control, shall we say.
Well, and that's a very complex topic that I also plan to. I've covered it some with Dr. Alan Williams, but I plan to cover it more as this whole peer-reviewed situation. And you've got the publications, we'll call them. I won't even call it a journal. Science and Nature, who published Prusner's work back in the 1980 to start. It's ridiculous. I mean, Prusner mentions himself that he told the editor, "Hey, don't pick this particular scientist to review this paper because she disagrees with me. And by the way, don't pick that particular researcher, investigator, because he also disagrees with me." And I'm sitting here going, "Wait a minute, we should probably, this is science. We should probably allow this."
It's very sad because we're kind of left, drifting about, not knowing, what's good research and what isn't, because you can't possibly go into every single paper you read and
they don't read them.
Follow.
They don't read. I do. When it comes to CWD and things that relate or pertain to white-tailed deer, I read them. And by the way, there's addendums and there's documentation that they don't publish with the paper that you have to dig up and find and et cetera. But I don't want to get too deep into that because that's what the rest of my podcasts are going to be about.
But I sort of deliberately over researched, the book, everything I've got in there, because I knew that I was going to hit sort of a cynical response. And what's interesting is that because I'd over researched it and presented it the way I did, the response from Science magazine and so on was, of course, you're right. I thought, okay.
Wow. I was gonna. That was one of my questions. Have you received any negative reviews or?
Only from pharmaceutical companies.
No shit. Imagine that.
No, the scientists are all going, yes, of course. Yeah, great. Health maintenance behavior, obviously adaptive. Yeah.
Good.
But there was some criticism from pharmaceutical companies because of me sort of dissing the direct germ theory idea that having the pathogen doesn't mean you've got the disease.
So my $1 million question. That's
the one.
It's now $1 billion or $1 trillion question. I love it.
That's what's happening in the world.
And I'm sure they've presented a massive amount of data to prove you wrong. No?
Well, what they didn't necessarily like about my thesis was that I was pointing out that because pharmaceutical companies are not allowed to go and steal the cultural medicine knowledge from indigenous peoples, but they can take it from animals. So they could watch primates and chimpanzees and see what they do and so on. And I was suggesting that, this unfortunately, that was where all the funding was going, was, let's look at what chimpanzees are eating as medicine and then we can patent it and make lots of money. And I was saying, hang on, don't keep rushing off to find a new drug. Let's look at the healthy chimpanzees and see what they're doing.
Right. But,
the same argument.
But how profitable is that, Cindy? Is that really profitable?
It's not profitable, no. But it's profitable if you're a farmer, isn't it? It's profitable if you're a farmer to know how to keep your animals healthy. It's not profitable if you're a pharmaceutical company because you need animals to be sick and so on.
This sort of reminds me in 2001-ish when I was heading off to study for my undergraduate degree. Sorry, my wires are getting all tangled. And chronic wasting disease was purportedly found in Wisconsin, a long way from Colorado and Wyoming. Everybody panicked. And I can remember a professor from a university, a researcher, one who, if he were to publish a YouTube video today, would get watched by many, said, in the name of publish or perish. I'm sure you've heard that, right? If these people don't publish, they perish. He
Yeah.
said, well, hey, here's the silver lining in all of this chronic wasting disease business. We can now slide CWD in any topic, and our ability to acquire the funding has just improved. So in other words, I don't know, take home range of white-tailed deer, right? Now all of a sudden, if we can show, that chronic wasting disease is spread more by one particular sex or during a particular season, etc., now we can sneak that into a home range study. And they were, I don't want to say rejoicing, but it was, again, sort of proposed as this silver lining to CWD that, again, publish or perish.
Well, it's always been that way that, I mean, I used to do animal behavior research that was just for my own interest, but the only way to get grants, to get money, was to make it applicable for someone else.
Sure.
Sure. They're not going to pay me to just do what I want to do.
Right. Well, and that's a great point. As I've dug into it since I was an undergraduate student, the CWD thing, and I avoided it. I just continued to apply science and questions, and how come or why couldn't we? And this is why I've recently decided to jump in, because as you've alluded, people don't know how to read the science. They don't know how to read the papers. Cindy, the professors who taught me how to rip apart a paper, and the at the time graduate students who sat there on a panel drilling us undergraduate students as we presented our work, those same people sit on very well-known podcasts today speaking complete rubbish, complete bullshit, and they don't show the data for anything.
And no one's challenging them.
No one's challenging because they don't read the papers. No one's reading the research because they don't know how to read the research.
But I think it's the kind of speed, the turnover now, because I can remember when I did my PhD and I wrote my first paper from a Canadian reproductive journal. It took 18 months to get from my desk to being published in the journal. You're lucky if it's going to take 18 days now. Wow. The speed of getting your information out, get it published as quickly as possible. There isn't, no one's taking the time to actually tear it apart.
Sure, that's what I enjoy
have the
doing.
Discussions.
And not to keep you too long, but just an example, because a lot of times I hear people complaining about stuff, and I say, give me an example. So there was a researcher from New York, and she may be gone now, but she was sort of sold as this CWD expert, right? And I thought to myself, she's never done any CWD research. How can she be an expert? Because she's, repeating what other people said about chronic wasting disease. Well, she decided to do some research, and she might even be involved with Pennsylvania now, I don't know, but some nonprofit organizations brought her on as an expert. And she said, look here, we did a human dimension study, and we asked hunters, would you be willing to, essentially shoot more deer or back off, whatever, not eat deer, blah, 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 in the name of chronic wasting disease? Would you not hunt? Would you give up this, all that, would you sacrifice things that most, Americans or humans don't want to do? And they overwhelmingly, she said absolutely. For CWD, we'll absolutely take these sacrifices. Typical government bullshit, right? We have to sacrifice because of them. And I went through the paper, I read it, and it was an opinion piece. And then I got to the very end where it said, oh, by the way, supplements are available to this research. And I dug into the supplements. Guess what one of the supplements was? It was the questionnaire that they supplied their hunters. And if you read that questionnaire, it was full of so much nonsense, essentially telling that it inferred that human beings can get chronic wasting disease, or that, we don't know, but it's definitely possible. And all of these things that persuaded the individual writing the yes or no or check this box. And I thought to myself, that's not science. That's junk science.
Yeah.
So
questionnaires are famously dodgy anyway, aren't they? Yes. It's really difficult to ask anybody anything and get a sensible answer.
Absolutely. Is there anything? Well, you know what? Before I ask you that, anytime I read a book that stays on my shelf as a reference, And by the way, you didn't pay me to do this, right?
I didn't pay you
I
to do
didn't,
this. It's amazing.
I didn't pay you to come on here. This type of work is very difficult to find nowadays. But when I
Yeah.
read a great book like that, Fred Provenza sent me a copy because he knows I'm a huge fan of nourishment, and it sits prominently up on my bookshelf in my office with a handwritten
Thank
note
you.
from Fred. But I make
Yeah.
these little note cards. So
Yep.
if I ever want to hand this book to somebody and they're too busy to read the entire book, or my kids, I say, hey, just pull the note cards out. So one day when I die, I'm hoping that they'll pull all the books and read what I thought was important in that particular book. And I just want to, I've got a bunch, but I want to grab a couple of them as kind of a closing. So
Okay.
my $1 trillion question was, hold on a second, what side am I on here? So again, this is when talking about wildlife that harbor diseases without showing symptoms, etc. You say whether you consider such animals to be healthy or not depends on whether you think the presence of the pathogen is the same as the presence of the disease. That to me is the greatest sentence or two sentences in that book. The other one, focus on individuals that remain healthy while others struggle. I'll even show these cards for those who are doubters. Modern wildlife struggle to self-medicate and nourish because of the dysfunction. And I have i.e. habitat degradation and loss, toxins, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
Harboring diseases without showing symptoms equals great health. The multitude of the sick shall not make us deny the existence of health. And scientists around the world regularly report that wild animals are infected with pathogens, which are disease-causing organisms, with absolutely zero symptoms whatsoever. So there's more of them. I just won't take up more of your time, but I just, in a nutshell, if you want to read the book, I think you should, because I'm only highlighting a few things. And of course, to me, the references in the back provided further reading, so thank you for that.
Yeah, and there's been more since. Well, thank you for your enthusiasm. That's great, and I hope, I hope you get heard in the wilderness. Your voice in the wilderness.
Yes, ma'am. Was there anything that you would like to add to summarize or share with?
I think you pulled out the main thrust is that we're always hearing about the threat to captive animals from wildlife, but actually or consider it the other way as well, and let's just focus on health rather than sickness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you. I think we nailed
Thank you.
it some 3 years
Yeah.
after we originally proposed it. I think the timing is perfect, and I thank you very much for the work that you do, and I just feel like you should be recognized more for writing.
Thank you.
Putting this book together had to be a massive undertaking.
It was 4 years in the making, just the writing of it. Yeah.
Fantastic.
But,
Well, congratulations on the success of the
Thank
book.
you.
And
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing an hour-ish of your time with
Yep.
us.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for listening. I hope everybody enjoyed that episode on Wild Health with Cindy Engel. And like I said, I appreciate your patience on the chronic wasting disease topic. I have found out way more than I ever thought I would, and someone needs to tell the rest of the story that just sits out there. At one point, it was told, but history sort of erased a significant amount of data and information, and really, really smart experts with whom we should be talking today about CWD and other TSCs. Also, well, on this podcast, if you don't mind, shoot me your thoughts, your input, any comments that you have, Jason at Drop-Tine podcast.com. And on another front with the seed, for those who are planning already for their 2026 season, shoot me an email, Jason at Drop-Tine.com, and let me know what your plans are, what your thoughts are. Like I said, mid to late January, we start to basically assemble all the fresh seed, depending on the species. Some do roll in February. But looking forward to helping everyone plan another successful 2026 season. Thank you for listening.